Most people never truly experience silence. Even alone, the mind continues speaking. A memory repeats itself. An imagined future begins to unfold. An old humiliation returns without invitation. A fear quietly whispers beneath ordinary thoughts. And slowly, this inner noise becomes so familiar that people stop questioning it. They begin to believe they are their thoughts. But according to Swami Sivananda, this is the beginning of bondage. Because the mind, when left undisciplined, does not remain neutral. It drifts toward distraction, toward impulse, toward anxiety, toward unconscious repetition. The average person does not think consciously. He merely reacts, like leaves carried by a violent wind. Look carefully at modern life. People wake up already mentally exhausted. Before the morning even begins, the mind is flooded with stimulation. Images, voices, messages, comparison, desire. And beneath all this movement, a deeper exhaustion grows. Not physical exhaustion, mental exhaustion. The exhaustion of never resting from thought. Sivananda taught that every thought leaves an impression upon the mind, like footsteps pressed repeatedly into wet soil. The more a thought is repeated, the deeper the path becomes. Eventually, the mind begins walking these paths automatically. This is how habits are born. Not only physical habits, mental habits, emotional habits, spiritual habits. A fearful thought repeated for years becomes a fearful personality. An angry mind repeated daily becomes suffering itself. A distracted mind loses the capacity to perceive reality clearly. This is why the sages treated thought with such seriousness. Because thought is not small. Thought shapes perception. Perception shapes action. Action shapes destiny. Most people attempt to change their lives externally while remaining internally chaotic. But the ancient masters understood something profound. Outer confusion is born from inner confusion. The world people experience is often nothing more than the projection of their dominant mental state. A restless mind creates a restless reality. An impure mind sees impurity everywhere. An agitated consciousness transforms existence into conflict. And this is why silence becomes frightening for many people. Because when external stimulation disappears, they are finally forced to encounter the condition of their own mind. For some, this encounter is unbearable. That is why people cling endlessly to distraction. Noise protects them from themselves, but silence reveals, and revelation is uncomfortable before it becomes liberating. Sivananda says the mind must be cultivated carefully, like a sacred garden. Because if the garden is neglected, weeds grow naturally. Negative thoughts do not require effort. Fear does not require training. Distraction happens automatically. But clarity must be cultivated consciously. This is the real spiritual battle. Not against the world, against unconscious thought, against compulsive mental movement, against the invisible forces that silently govern human behavior from within. Most people believe freedom means doing whatever they desire, but the sages taught the opposite. If a person cannot control the direction of attention, there is no freedom, only reaction, only conditioning, only slavery disguised as choice. True freedom begins the moment a human being realizes, I do not have to follow every thought that appears in my mind. And perhaps that realization changes everything. The mind is shaped by repetition, not by intensity, not by occasional inspiration, not by temporary motivation, but by what is repeated daily, silently, without interruption. Swami Sivananda taught that every thought creates a subtle movement within the mind, and when that movement is repeated long enough, it becomes a force, a tendency, a habit, eventually, a destiny. Most people underestimate this. They believe thoughts disappear after they arise, but thoughts do not disappear completely. They leave traces, invisible impressions carved into consciousness itself. In the yogic tradition, these impressions become mental pathways, and the mind begins returning to them automatically. This is why certain fears repeat themselves endlessly. Why anxiety returns even after moments of peace. Why some people cannot stop overthinking. Why others remain trapped in cycles they consciously wish to escape. Because the mind becomes conditioned through unconscious repetition. A single negative thought may seem harmless, but repeated for years, it becomes identity, silence. This is why Sivananda insisted so strongly on vigilance. Observe the mind carefully, not occasionally, constantly. Because the moment a destructive thought enters unnoticed, it begins creating roots, and thoughts with roots become difficult to remove. The sages compared this process to a garden. When weeds are still small, they are easy to pull from the earth, but when neglected, their roots spread deep beneath the surface. The same happens inside the mind. A small resentment becomes bitterness. A passing desire becomes addiction. A moment of insecurity becomes self-hatred. Everything grows through repetition, both darkness and light. This is why spiritual discipline begins with attention. Attention is nourishment. Whatever receives attention becomes stronger. Most people unknowingly feed fear every day. They rehearse worst-case scenarios, replay painful memories, repeat internal criticism, strengthen anxiety through constant mental repetition, and then they wonder why peace feels distant. But the mind simply expands whatever it repeatedly receives. Sivananda offered a radically different path. Instead of feeding chaotic thought, feed the mind with a higher ideal. One sacred thought, one divine name, one elevated principle. Again, and again, and again. Not violently, not forcefully, but patiently. Like water, slowly reshaping stone. This is the true purpose behind mantra repetition, not blind ritual. Mental purification. The repetition of sacred sound interrupts unconscious mental patterns. It redirects attention away from fragmentation, away from compulsive thinking, away from the endless noise of the world. A mantra becomes an anchor in the storm, a center, a rhythm, a return. That is why the sages repeated Om, not because the sound itself was magical in a superficial sense, but because sustained concentration reorganizes consciousness. The modern mind is scattered in 1,000 directions. The mantra gathers it back into one, and a mind moving in one direction becomes powerful, extremely powerful. Look at sunlight. Diffused sunlight warms gently, but concentrated sunlight can ignite fire. The same is true of thought. A scattered mind remains weak. A concentrated mind transforms reality itself. This is why Sivananda warned against allowing the mind to wander endlessly, because an uncontrolled mind wastes life force continuously. Attention leaks into triviality, desire, comparison, impulse. Mental exhaustion becomes inevitable. But when attention is disciplined, something extraordinary begins to happen. Inner noise slowly weakens. Thoughts lose their compulsive force. The mind becomes lighter, clearer, still. And in rare moments, a human being may finally experience something unfamiliar. Peace without external conditions. Not pleasure. Not distraction. Not entertainment. But genuine inner stillness. the kind of silence modern life has almost completely forgotten. Most people are controlled by thoughts they never observe. A reaction appears, and immediately becomes action. Anger arises, and the body obeys it. Fear appears, and behavior changes instantly. Desire emerges, and attention follows automatically. This happens all day long, without awareness, without resistance, without silence. According to Swami Sivananda, this is the true condition of the ordinary mind: mechanical, compulsive, restless. Human beings believe they are acting freely, while being silently directed by unconscious mental patterns. The sages saw this clearly, and that is why they insisted on one practice above all others: observation, not suppression, not violence against the mind. Observation, because the moment thoughts are observed consciously, their power begins to weaken. A thought thrives in unconsciousness. It survives through identification. The moment a person becomes aware, this is only a thought, a distance appears, and within that distance, freedom begins. Sivananda warned against fighting thoughts aggressively, because resistance often strengthens what it tries to destroy. The harder a person struggles against certain thoughts, the more attention is unconsciously feeding them. This is why the mind becomes exhausted. People spend years fighting internally, trying to force silence, trying to force peace, trying to force control. But force alone cannot calm the mind. Awareness can. The sages taught that thoughts should be treated like passing visitors. They arrive. They remain briefly. Then they disappear. But most people invite them to stay. They feed them emotionally. They repeat them mentally. They build entire identities around temporary mental movements. And slowly, suffering becomes personalized. A passing emotion becomes, "This is who I am." But Sivananda taught something entirely different. The mind is not the self. Thoughts are movements within consciousness, not consciousness itself. This distinction changes everything, because if thoughts can be observed, there must be something beyond thought observing them. Something deeper, something untouched, something silent beneath all mental activity. The modern world rarely teaches people to observe themselves internally. It teaches reaction, consumption, expression, constant stimulation, but almost never observation. This is why silence feels unbearable to many people, because silence exposes the condition of the mind directly, without distraction. The hidden chaos becomes visible, and for the first time, a person realizes how little control truly exists internally. The sages compared the untrained mind to a wild animal, not evil, but undisciplined. If ignored, it grows stronger. If constantly fed stimulation, it becomes uncontrollable. But if patiently trained, it becomes an extraordinary instrument. This is where meditation truly begins, not in mystical visions, not in supernatural experiences, but in simple awareness, watching, observing, remaining present without immediately reacting. At first, this feels impossible. The mind jumps endlessly, one thought after another, one memory after another, one fear after another, like waves colliding against each other in darkness. But Sivananda taught that persistence changes everything. Gradually, the waves weaken. The intervals between thoughts become longer. The inner atmosphere changes, and something unexpected emerges from beneath the noise. Stillness, not forced stillness, natural stillness. A silence that was always present beneath the turbulence of the mind. This is why the masters valued solitude, because only in silence can the machinery of the mind finally be seen clearly. Most people spend their entire lives escaping themselves. The sages chose the opposite path. They sat quietly and observed. And through observation, they discovered freedom hidden beneath thought itself. The mind cannot be transformed accidentally. It must be trained, purified, disciplined, not for punishment, but for liberation. Swami Sivananda taught that spiritual growth requires inner effort, a deliberate effort against mental chaos, because the ordinary mind naturally falls downward, toward distraction, toward desire, toward emotional turbulence, toward unconscious living. Without discipline, the mind becomes a prison built from repetition, and most people never realize the bars are internal. They blame circumstances. They blame society. They blame the world. But the sages understood that suffering begins much deeper, inside the structure of thought itself. This is why Sivananda emphasized vigilance with such intensity. The moment a negative thought appears, observe it immediately. Do not nourish it. Do not identify with it. Do not allow it to build roots in the mind, because a thought repeated enough times eventually becomes behavior. And behavior repeated long enough becomes character. This is how invisible thoughts shape visible lives. A person does not suddenly become anxious. The mind has been rehearsing anxiety silently for years. A person does not suddenly lose peace. Peace was slowly abandoned through unconscious mental habits. The sages saw thought as creative power, not metaphorically, literally. Every repeated thought influences perception, and perception shapes reality. This is why Sivananda taught the importance of replacing lower thoughts with higher ones, not suppressing darkness, but starving it, because whatever is not fed begins to weaken. Most people attempt to eliminate negativity by fighting it directly, but attention itself becomes nourishment. The more obsessively a person resists certain thoughts, the stronger they often become. This is why the masters taught substitution. When anger appears, bring peace into the mind. When fear appears, bring clarity. When agitation appears, return to sacred remembrance. Sivananda recommended repeating Om Shanti, not as empty ritual, but as psychological reorientation, a conscious interruption of mental turbulence. The sound becomes a doorway away from reaction, away from emotional possession, away from unconscious impulse. Modern people underestimate the power of internal language, but the mind is constantly listening to itself. Every internal sentence becomes suggestion. Every repeated emotion becomes conditioning. This is why the world has become mentally exhausted. People continuously repeat narratives of fear internally. I am not enough. Something is wrong. I will fail. I cannot change. And eventually, the mind begins accepting repetition as truth. But the sages taught something radical. Thought is programmable. The inner world can be reshaped consciously. Not instantly, but gradually, through repetition, through discipline, through sustained awareness. This is why Sivananda called willpower the king of mental powers. Because without will, the mind remains a servant to impulse. The weak mind follows every distraction, every desire, every emotional storm. But the disciplined mind becomes stable like a mountain. Calm in the middle of movement, silent in the middle of noise, unaffected by temporary turbulence. This does not mean emotions disappear completely. It means consciousness is no longer enslaved by them. And this is true strength. Not domination over others, domination over oneself. The modern world glorifies external power. The sages glorified inner mastery, because conquering a nation is easier than conquering the mind. Anyone can react. Few can remain conscious during emotional chaos. Anyone can be pulled by impulse. Few can remain centered internally. That is why spiritual discipline is rare. Because it demands responsibility. It demands awareness. It demands persistence. But slowly, through constant practice, something begins to burn inside the mind. Not destruction. Purification. Old patterns weaken. Compulsive thoughts lose intensity. Mental noise fades. And beneath the ashes of inner conflict, clarity begins to appear. There is a silence hidden beneath the mind. Not the silence of the world, not the silence of an empty room. A deeper silence. A silence untouched by thought itself. Most people never encounter it, because their attention is consumed continuously by movement. One thought leads to another. One desire creates another desire. One fear gives birth to 10 more fears. The mind remains in constant motion. And because of this endless movement, human beings forget something essential. They are not the movement. They are the awareness beneath it. Swami Sivananda taught that true meditation begins the moment a person stops identifying completely with thought, not suppressing thought violently, not escaping reality, but resting beyond mental turbulence, like the sky resting beyond storms. The clouds move, the sky remains, thoughts appear, thoughts disappear, but awareness itself remains untouched. This realization changes the entire structure of human experience. Because suffering depends largely on identification. The mind says, I am afraid. But the sages ask, who is observing the fear? The mind says, I am anxious. But who notices the anxiety? The mind says, I am lost. But who is aware of the confusion? There is something deeper than thought observing all mental movement silently. Something stable. Something ancient. Something impossible to disturb completely. The sages called this consciousness pure awareness. The witnessing presence behind the mind. Modern life keeps people trapped at the surface of themselves. Constant stimulation prevents inward perception. The mind becomes addicted to noise because noise prevents self-confrontation. Silence forces a human being to encounter what has been avoided internally for years. This is why many people fear stillness. In silence, there is nowhere left to escape. But Sivananda taught that if a person remains patient, if awareness remains steady, if discipline continues, the mind slowly loses its tyranny. Thoughts become lighter. Emotions stop dominating consciousness completely. Mental storms pass more quickly. And eventually, moments of profound stillness begin appearing naturally. Not created, revealed. Because peace was never absent. It was simply covered by endless mental movement. The sages understood something modern society has almost forgotten. Happiness is not found through constant stimulation. Not through endless consumption. Not through accumulation. Not through external noise. Real peace emerges when the mind ceases exhausting itself. When thought slows down. When desire loosens its grip. When attention returns inward. This is why solitude became sacred among the ancient masters. Because only in stillness can the deeper dimensions of consciousness become visible. A disturbed lake cannot reflect the moon clearly. A disturbed mind cannot perceive truth clearly. But when the waters finally become still, reflection becomes possible. Clarity becomes possible. Freedom becomes possible. This is the transformation Sivananda pointed toward. Not becoming someone else, not escaping the world, but purifying perception itself, seeing clearly, living consciously, remaining inwardly untouched by the chaos of life. And perhaps this is the greatest secret the sages discovered. The mind can become silent, not permanently, not perfectly, but enough for something extraordinary to emerge from beneath the noise. A presence beyond thought. A peace independent of circumstances. A freedom that does not depend on the world. And once even a glimpse of this silence is experienced, ordinary distractions no longer feel the same, because somewhere inside, the soul has remembered its own stillness.